Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 5 as we look at the second portion of Judaism. And we left off with, of course, the Jews attempting to revolt against the Roman Empire, but the attempt was unsuccessful, and the Romans destroyed the temple, what's known as the Second Temple, Judaism, but destroyed the temple in 70 CE, traditionally on the same date that it was destroyed nearly 500 years before. So, moving forward, let's look a little bit at the Jewish identity after the temple. And of course, we do have a cross there, Christianity's most well-known symbol, as Christianity is going to come in here a little bit. But one thing to point out, and I've mentioned this previously, is that many of the 613 commandments of the Torah, or law, could no longer be practiced. I've mentioned that the Torah, the law, contains 613 commandments. The 10 commandments are just but 10 of the 613 laws. And I also mentioned how modern day Jews cannot practice or follow all of those laws because a lot of them relate to the temple system, the temple cult, and there is no longer a temple. And the Jewish people have had no desire to bring back the temple, even though in theory today they could. I'd say probably a major reason why is because Judaism has been practiced the way that it has for, essentially 1900 years. To think of it another way, from the time period of the destruction of the first temple, Solomon's temple, to the beginnings of the second, you had about a 50-year gap in time. In fact, the text in Isaiah and I believe Ezra mentioned that there were those that could remember the first temple, the temple built by Solomon, when the second temple was being dedicated. You don't have that with the case within, Judaism today. And so, Jews have really had no desire to try to bring back the temple. At least the majority of them have not. There's arguably going to be a minority that would like to see the temple brought back, but the vast majority have, no desire to try and reestablish a third temple, you could say. Well, then, in 90 CE, while not closing the canon, an agreement among rabbis declared that the Hebrew scriptures were valid for the Jewish people and that the later Greek books of the Septuagint were to be rejected. Well, there's a couple things to mention here. If I was teaching this class 100 years ago, I probably would have stated that this was the closing of the Hebrew Bible for the Jewish people. But when historians went back and re-examined the evidence, they came to a different conclusion. Essentially, what was going on here was that after the destruction of Judea, the only significant rabbinical school, which, the Jewish people had to get agreement for from the Romans to allow to be built, was a school in an area called Jamnia. And because this was really the major significant school, the points of view coming out of that school carried a lot of weight. And so the rabbis, at that school declared that only, the manuscripts that were part of, you could say, the original, Hebrew Bible, that this is what is valid for the Jewish people. And the works that, became part of the Septuagint, while not removing their historical importance, they were later, rejected. Well, the Septuagint, however, continued to be used by Christians because Christians held that it supported their views of Jesus. So, for the early Christian community, the Septuagint was essentially their Old Testament. And, some examples of how they use the Septuagint. One of the most prominent, I would say, is in Matthew's Gospel, where he is citing Isaiah, and he mentions how the virgin shall conceive and bear forth, a child, a son. Well, the actual Hebrew rendering of that passage is not virgin, it's maiden or young woman. But the Greek, the Septuagint, renders the passage as virgin. And I'll also point out that not all within early Christianity held that Jesus was born of a virgin. And I'll also mention that of all the messianic prophecies that he is said to have fulfilled, being born of a virgin is not one of them. Another example I can think of, with the early Christian use of the Septuagint, I think of the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Galatians, one of the things that Paul mentions regarding the Torah, the law, the major argument of Paul's theology was that the death of Jesus did away with the Torah/law, which not all early Christians agreed with Paul on. But in the letter to the Galatians, Paul makes the argument that how the law was essentially ordained, given to Moses through angels. Basically, Paul is trying to do this in many respects, or the argument being made, doing this in many respects, to try and, weaken the law. The earliest manuscripts where Paul is he's referencing chapter 33 of Deuteronomy. The earliest Hebrew manuscripts does not have a reference to angels being around the giving of the Torah, the law. But there is a reference to angels in the Greek, in the Septuagint. So, in any case, the Septuagint, this Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, was, for the early Christian community, this was essentially their Old Testament, what they would call the Old Testament. Well, now let's move forward about 1700 so years into the future, where we have Moses Mendelson, a German Jew. Well, Moses Mendelson, he declared that two things were needed regarding Jews and Judaism. And what exactly were those two things? Well, the first was that the Jewish people need to get out of the ghettos. One of the things I decided not to use as an image with my lecture was the image of the yellow star that has become associated with the Holocaust, the yellow star that has the word Yud or Jew on it. But the origins behind that star, in many respects, relate to the Jewish ghettos. If you were to look at old maps of European cities, you'll often at times find an area on the map that is colored in yellow. Well, that was a Jewish ghetto. And essentially, the origins of the ghettos were that the Christian rulers basically told the Jewish people, this is your area, and here you stay, more or less. Or here's where I guess you could say you live, more or less. And going into one of those ghettos was in many respects taking a trip back into time. In the case with Mendelson, he is living in the 18th century, but going into one of those ghettos, he might as well be transferred back to the Middle Ages. So Mendelson is like, no, we need to move forward. We need to be, with our Gentile, our non-Jewish, brothers and sisters and move forward. And then the other point that he made was that a lot of the practices of the Torah or the law are no longer necessary. Now, I mentioned previously that the Torah/law, it contains 613 commandments. Modern-day Jews cannot practice all of the 613 because a lot of them relate to the temple system, the temple cult, and there is no longer a temple. But even among those that can still be practiced, Mendelson makes the argument that those are things from all, in the past. Like, for example, the dietary laws of the Torah. I'm sure there are plenty of you that have had a cheeseburger. Well, according to the dietary laws of the Torah, you can't have such things. If you consume meat, you're supposed to wait at least an hour before you consume dairy. But you can consume grasshoppers, you can eat locusts. The Torah approves of that. Another thing, I think of one of my colleagues, I mentioned her previously, and I know I'll mention her again, who's Jewish. And she told me, she said, Cody, I like my hair. Why should I have to have my hair covered? Because among conservative Jews, they will either have their hair covered or they will wear a wig. And then she would also ask me, she would state, how is it that driving your car on the Sabbath is considered to be working on the Sabbath and thus breaking the Sabbath, but walking to the synagogue on the Sabbath is not? Well, it has to do with the burning of fuel. But to mention something else regarding my one colleague, and this is why she's not, she told me she's not fond, I guess you could say, of fanatical religion. But she mentioned how her grandfather had this religious experience where he became this hardcore practicing Jew. And she told me how he would lay out like pieces of toilet paper because he felt that on the Sabbath day, if you were to pull down or push on the roll, you would be working on the Sabbath and thus breaking it. Well, I'm just about out of time here, so I'll continue on with this point in the next video.